I think there's something following me. Lately, I've been experiencing a range of inexplicable sensations that have left me feeling confused, unsettled, and even a little bit frightened. It all started with a persistent tapping on my left shoulder that seemed to linger there for what felt like an eternity, making it impossible to ignore. The sensation was so persistent that I began to wonder whether there was something physically wrong with me, but I couldn't seem to find any explanation for it. Over time, the tapping continued, but with greater intensity. I began to feel something else, something that was hard to describe. It was like an impact, a soft punch that didn't really hurt, but left a strange feeling in its wake. It was as if something was trying to get my attention, to communicate with me in some way that I couldn't quite understand. As if this wasn't enough, I began to hear whispers and see movements out of the corners of my eyes. My belongings were also being moved from where I left them, making me feel as if I was going crazy. I tried to rationalize the situation, thinking that perhaps it was just my imagination running wild and I was experiencing just some kind of mental illness, but I'd never had any problems like this before. I got to the point where these experiences started to impact my daily life, and I knew that I had to do something about it. I began to research possible explanations for what was happening to me, but I couldn't find anything that made sense. I decided to try to ignore the sensations and movements, hoping that they would eventually go away on their own, but they persisted, and I knew that I had to take on more drastic measures. Finally, I made the decision to see a doctor and get my mental and physical health checked. I knew that it was possible that I was suffering from some kind of mental illness, or maybe there was something physically wrong with me that was causing these experiences. I was pretty scared and unsure of what to expect, but I knew that I had to take action. After some time, most of the experiences stopped, but I still intended to follow through with my plans to get my mental and physical health checked. I want to make sure that this isn't a one-off occurrence and that I'm taking care of myself in every way possible. I hope that by sharing my story, others may be experiencing similar sensations and movements and will feel less alone and know that they're not going crazy. I heard that the NDSU is haunted. Has anybody had any experiences? To begin, I'm an amateur journalist. I began writing stories and short poems a few years ago after meeting a man who soon became my best friend, and who also vanished from my life soon after. Some of my works I had submitted to my former high school English professor for assignments. She informed me about the opening at the local newspaper where I began my career as a journalist. A few months before writing this article, I had moved to North Dakota. This is the first time I've lived in a different state other than South Dakota, my homeland. I find it fascinating that out of 7 children in my family, I was the last one to have ever left the state. After moving to the Rough Rider state, I began looking for a job. I took a couple months to do it, and during that time, I began to get very close to death by boredom. I believe my cat was the one thing that kept me sane throughout the struggle I faced. I've always been interested in paranormal or unknown things, I guess you could say. And after being unemployed for some amount of time, I ran out of shows to binge watch and scary YouTube videos to view. I began wondering if there were any abandoned buildings with creepy histories or haunted properties that I could learn about. So, like any young person nowadays, I took to the internet and Googled it. I typed in the search bar, haunted locations in my area. From there, I scrolled down, clicking on any trustworthy-looking links and websites. I was mainly looking for properties and buildings that looked run down and very old, but I found something else. A college campus rumored to be haunted by a man who hung himself during World War II, and several murder victims and supposed suicides. That college was North Dakota State University, and that's where this begins. Ceres Hall. At 1301 Administration Avenue in Fargo, North Dakota, Ceres Hall was the first women's dormitory on the North Dakota Agricultural College campus. The building was renovated to accommodate 50 women. Now, the building is also home to the Office of Administration, Career and Advising Center, Enrollment Management, and other services. We all know that life as a student can be a struggle, and the weight of having perfect grades can hang heavy on her shoulders. One of the ghosts that reportedly haunts the Ceres Hall is a young female student. It's rumored that she took her life by hanging herself on the 3rd floor due to having poor grades. It's also rumored that the 3rd floor is where a man hung himself from the heating pipe during the Second World War. While neither of these deaths have been verified by a reliable source, they sure do add some excitement to student life on campus. It's said that the basement and the 3rd floor are locations of the most supernatural activity in the Ceres Hall. At night, you're able to hear the slamming of doors up and down the hallways of the 3rd floor, loud noises making their way through the night, and lights going out, engulfing entire floors in complete darkness. Students have reported feeling a strange and uneasy presence around them as well. Upon entering the basement, some people have experienced feeling panicked, and under duress in 2007, a paranormal crew of FM Paranormal conducted an investigation. Sean O'Donnell and Charles Dosh brought along cameras and recording equipment to document their experiences. O'Donnell recalls seeing a shadow near one of the doors moving in and out. Upon further inspection, he found that by the area in the wall where the shadow was, it was very cold. Dosh started that the team had heard whispers from the corners and had witnessed a red ball of light in the area of the basement. Menard Hall. At 1210 Albrecht Boulevard in Fargo, North Dakota, Menard Hall was originally named Science Hall. It was to be built in 3 stages, and among the offices and departments located in this hall are biology, geology, horticulture, anthropology, and NDSU Press. The 1902-03 NDAC catalog described Science Hall as one of the most artistic buildings on campus, being well lit and ventilated and finished with quarter-sawed oak. In the 1920s, dances were held on the 4th floor of the Science Hall. A rumor's been going around that since that time, one morning after dance hall had been held, a janitor went to the 4th floor to give away its daily cleaning. Upon entering, he discovered 2 murder victims. Just like the 2 fateful stories told before, I was unable to verify the truth behind this one, but nevertheless, it adds to the excitement. In 2009, part of Menard Hall had collapsed due to being built on top of weak clay, leaving a gaping hole in the middle of the structure. In return, NDSU had received more than $3 million in damages. While the damages have been repaired since the collapse, students are still reporting feelings of uneasiness radiating from the 4th floor. It's advised that you do not go there on your own and investigate during the night. While many pass these stories off as just legends, others like myself would like to believe there's some truth behind them. I plan on one day exploring these 2 buildings in hope of experiencing the ominous feelings of being watched, the slamming of doors when no one's behind them, or quiet whispers coming from the back of the room. But until that day comes, I'll have to entertain myself with only the possibilities. Creepy things happening in a graveyard. On the night of April 13th, 2020, a friend and I were walking past a graveyard that I had been in several times before, during the daytime, but never at night. Not for any specific paranormal reason, just I don't want to go into secluded areas at night. I looked into the graveyard from behind a 1-meter-high wooden fence that surrounded it, and I saw something strange. The area is surrounded by trees and gravestones, but I swear I saw the outline of a person. I think he was wearing a black suit from the glimpse I got, as well as black pants and a black hat. But it was extremely hard to tell, and it could have been any color, just not visible in the black of night. My first instinct was maybe a person paying their respects late at night, and then I saw the shadow walk behind a large tree. In the direction that he was walking, I should have seen him walk back into my view on the other side of the tree, but he didn't. I asked my friend and we decided to investigate. We walked a bit to get a quick view of behind the tree. Unless the person had ran, we should have been able to see him walking away or standing behind the tree, but we didn't. It was almost as if he had vanished. We walked into the graveyard, which by the way had cameras, and it was legal to walk into 24/7, and walked up to the tree. Behind the tree was an unmarked grave, no headstone, but a single rose that looked fresh, not wilted at all. Now obviously, we chalked it up to a normal person, nothing paranormal about it. I guess he just slipped out of our field of view and went far away enough that we couldn't see him. Then we realized our footprints were clearly visible in the dirt around where he was standing, but his weren't. We came back the next night for shits and giggles and saw the same figure, same height, same clothing, at the same spot that we were when I had caught a glimpse of the man standing next to the same tree. It appears as if he had turned his head at us, then back in front of him and walked behind the tree again. We did the same thing. We walked back up behind the tree and didn't find any sign of him, despite the fact that it was like a 30-second walk, and the pace at which someone walks in 30 seconds shouldn't put him outside of our field of view. No footprints or disturbed dirt, and the rose was gone, even though I'd visited earlier in the day to attempt to photograph the grave and it was still there. My friend said it was very strange that maybe it had been a real person. We caught him 2 nights in a row at the same spot. At different times of the night, too. We went there 2 nights in a row and nothing, didn't see him again after that. Had we just caught a ghost in a graveyard? I guess we'll never know. Encounter with Bila Pani. I've been a geocacher for over 10 years, and it used to be pretty popular in the Czech Republic. Lots of people hid caches to spread awareness or to pay respects to old buildings or those who have passed. About 8 years ago, I came across a cache on my map. It was the cache of Panna Bila. Some background information. Bila Pani, or White Lady, is believed to haunt Český Krumlov, which is the town in the Czech Republic. The legend says that the White Lady appears in and around the castle of Krumlov Castle, which is located in the town. The White Lady is the ghost of Percha Rosenberg, a noblewoman who lived in the castle during the 16th century. She appears as a white figure walking in the area, and her presence is a sign of impending disaster or death. Every geocache has instructions on where, how, and when to find them, as some can only be seen at specific times. This cache, however, came with instructions to go absolutely not at night. It was believed that Panna Bila roamed the area and demanded silence on her property. Being there at night would disturb her rest, and there's not something that you want to do or want to be responsible for. Being the skeptic thrill seeker that I was, I wanted to go right away. Because who's going to be there to stop me? A dead woman in a nightgown? Well, not exactly, but I did want to witness something. I was in the woods surrounding the castle. I always took my dog with me when I went into the woods. I take him for the night walk, and he loves and he scares boars away. Win-win, right? I was using the GPS device that I always take with me during cache hunting. It was more accurate than the app back then. It was working fine until at one moment it just went a little crazy. I'm not talking about it being a little off. The game was to find the coordinates, and then you still had about a 30-meter range to actually look for the cache. So that would have been pretty normal. I'm talking about a device sending me hundreds of meters in a direction just after it told me I'm 20 meters away from the given coordinates. I reset it because I thought it was just an error, but it kept doing the same thing. Just every time I reset it, it was a different number. Since I was just a few meters away from the location, I decided to just count my meters since I knew it was like 20 meters, until I suddenly felt chilly. Note that it was midsummer, and even though it was at night, it was still around 25 degrees. There was no wind, and I wasn't tired or anything. And even if it was wind, it would have been warm. I eventually turned my ass around after my dog started squeaking, and I'm telling you that dog was a beast. May his kind, fluffy soul rest in peace. He wasn't scared of anything, and if there was a person or animal near at night, he would bark and growl, not squeak and keep his tail behind his legs. I decided to leave because I thought maybe my dog wasn't well, but I wanted to take a picture at least, because at least it would be cool if it was there at night. Planning to go back during the day. I remember thinking, haha, my battery's at 69%. I know I'm a douchebag. Anyway, when I got out of the woods and found my car parked to the side, my dog was completely fine. He wasn't tired, hungry, or unwell at all. Not only that, I checked my GPS again in fear of having to throw it away because it broke or something. It worked perfectly. Lastly, my phone battery was at 20%. Safe to say that I started to question my beliefs a little bit at this point, especially when I wanted to take a look at the picture. They were all corrupted. That one time when a voice helped me on an exam. Once upon a time, not so long ago, I found myself in an unfamiliar situation. I had to take a highly significant exam at a different school under the supervision of teachers I'd never met before. The exam syllabus had been disclosed to us beforehand, but the catch was that each of us had to randomly select a topic from a paper that we had to pull out of a container. Standing second in line, I was suddenly jolted by a voice that shattered my composure. "Pull the first one." My senses went numb and I tried to act cool, as if nothing had happened. However, the voice persisted. "What are you waiting for? Pull the first one." My mind raced with questions. Who was this person? Why was he or she so insistent? What was the significance of pulling the first paper? With trepidation, I blurted out, "But why? Can't you tell me the reason? Stop wasting time and pull the paper." Thinking to myself that I was better to comply than to create a scene, with trembling hands I reached for the first paper. And as I unfolded it, a sense of incredulity engulfed me. The question was so straightforward and uncomplicated that I felt as if I was engaged in a casual conversation rather than a crucial exam. To my surprise, I realized that this topic was not part of the curriculum that had been shared with us. Incredibly, I found myself answering the question with ease and scoring a perfect 100%, something I'd never imagined. This experience taught me that sometimes the unexpected can lead to pleasant surprises, and that things are not always what they seem. The Funeral Crasher. It's with great sorrow that I share this heartbreaking story of my son's untimely death. As fate would have it, neither I nor my ex-husband had many friends or close relatives, so when it came time to bid farewell to our beloved child, there were only about 10 people in attendance. The funeral was held at my ex-mother-in-law's house, where her son was cremated, surrounded by those who had known him for years. However, something strange happened at the funeral that still haunts me to this day. About a week after the event, numerous people started asking me about a strange lady that they had claimed to have seen at the funeral. According to their accounts, she was incredibly tall and didn't introduce herself by a name. She spoke briefly to a couple of people and then vanished without saying goodbye. Shockingly, some of these people even swore to me that they had spoken to her, but couldn't remember the details of the conversation. At first, I thought that the strange lady might just be my adoptive mother, but when I showed them her picture, it became clear that it wasn't her. She also confirmed that she had not attended the funeral based on the people she had spoken to. I stayed in the kitchen almost half the entire time, barely interacting with anyone due to obvious reasons, and only stepped out for the 5-minute outdoor event. Even then, I only answered a few questions about the food and service timing. To this day, I still have no clue who the strange lady was, or why she showed up at the funeral. It remains a mystery, and I can't shake the feeling that I might have missed out on an important conversation that could have brought me some closure in the aftermath of my son's death. Despite my best efforts, I'm left with more questions than answers, and the memory of that day still haunts me. For nearly 2 years, my husband has taken the same route to work twice a day, every day. We've become so accustomed to the scenery along the way that we hardly pay attention anymore. But one day we noticed something out of the ordinary. A large house, squeezed between 2 smaller houses, looking completely out of place. We briefly discussed it, but then forgot about it. A few days later, on our way home from work, we remembered the strange house and decided to take a slow drive past it. But when we reached the spot where it should have been, it was nowhere to be seen. We drove up and down the road 5 or 6 times, but it was as if the house had vanished into thin air. The 2 smaller houses that had been sandwiched between were still there, but the large house was gone. Days went by and my husband passed the spot again, alone this time. He took more time to look around, and to his surprise, the house had reappeared. This time, he noticed some distinct features. Large columns and a specific-looking witch window. There was no mailbox or address number anywhere in sight, and there was never any furniture, and the porch curtains and the windows were drawn. It was unlike any of the prefab houses around it, and it gave us an eerie feeling. Since then, the house has continued to appear and disappear sporadically, almost as if it's playing a game of hide-and-seek with us. We've never been able to catch it at the same time twice, and we still haven't managed to snap a photo of it, but tonight we'll try again since it was there and we drove by earlier. This mysterious house has become a constant source of fascination and intrigue for us, and we can't help but wonder about its origins and its purpose. Gifts from the universe. There have been instances in my life where I've intentionally given away items, only to have them reappear in my possession in unexplainable ways. The first occurrence was with the blanket and the pillow that my mother had made for my daughter. Knowing I would never see her again, I only gave her the pillow and kept the blanket for myself. Recently, while thinking about my departed son and daughter, I retrieved the blanket only to find the pillow with it, despite having no logical reason to be there. Another experience involved a baby bed and a mobile that I had carefully selected for my younger son. After he outgrew it, I gave it away to a stranger in need. Months later, during a particularly difficult time while in a custody battle with my ex, I found one of these 3 bears from the mobile sitting in my washing machine. I can't explain how it got there. The most perplexing occurrence was with a decorative belt that belonged to my grandmother. Though I was not particularly close to her, I ended up with the belt and gave it away multiple times, even throwing it away, only to have it reappear in my possession again and again. While I'm saddened by these events, I can't help but wonder if there's any sign or something greater. Perhaps these items are returning to me as a message that I need them more than I realize. I'm also curious if anyone else has had similar experiences and what their opinion is on the matter. Time lost. Let me tell you a bizarre tale that's been haunting me since the American Easter yesterday. You see, I have a peculiar habit of sleeping in shorts or nothing at all. Locked in my room and entirely alone, it's an essential routine that I follow diligently. Now, coming back to yesterday, we begin the typical Easter celebrations around 11 and continue until approximately noon. We did everything from egg hunts to Easter baskets, from dyeing eggs to lunch, and all the traditional Easter things, but something strange happened that I still can't explain. I distinctly remember the egg hunt and the Easter baskets, but the next thing I knew, I was standing in the middle of the room in nothing but my sleep skivvies. It was already 4 p.m. and everyone was staring at me in disbelief. What's more strange is that I have no memory of the 4 hours in between. Despite the presence of trash in the bin, I have no recollection of the cleanup. Although there were dyed eggs all around, I have no memory of dyeing them. And although everyone insisted that I ate lunch, I have absolutely no memory of it whatsoever. It's not just my imagination playing tricks on me. No less than 4 people corroborated my story, and there were no drugs or alcohol involved. So the question that haunts me is, what happened? What could have caused such a bizarre memory lapse? I'm left with more questions than answers and a sense of unease that lingers. It's a strange Easter indeed. A ghost of my sister who is still alive. 15 years ago, I had an eerie encounter that stayed with me ever since. At the time, I lived in a haunted apartment, and I had played with the Ouija board a few times. Many paranormal incidents occurred during the stay there, which still leaves me shaken and fascinated by the unknown, and this led me to start a paranormal podcast to explore such phenomena further. I vividly remember the night when I was about 14 and alone at home. I was sitting at the family desktop computer engrossed in my work when I felt a sudden presence behind me. I turned around to find someone who looked like my older sister, but dressed in 1800s attire, staring at me intently. To my horror, I realized that it couldn't be my sister since she was alive and well. I was paralyzed with fear and couldn't bring myself to move for the rest of the night. For years, I tried to rationalize what had happened. I thought about every possibility, including whether it could have been a deceased family member who resembled my sister, or if she had a twin who didn't make it. Despite my attempts to find answers, I'm still left with an unsolved mystery that haunts me to this day. I'm curious if anyone else has had a similar experience, or any insight into what might have happened that night. Perhaps there's more to the paranormal world than what we can perceive, and encounters like this may offer a glimpse into the unknown. As I continue to explore and investigate paranormal activity through my podcast, I hope to uncover more mysteries and connect with others who have had similar experiences. Any stories of haunted malls from retail workers or ex-retail workers? Have any of you ever experienced the eerie feeling of a haunted mall in LA? Specifically, have you ever heard of the Fox Mills Hall? If not, I'm eager to hear any stories from ex-retail or current retail workers who have worked there, or who may have seen or felt something out of the ordinary. This might seem like a very specific scenario, but as someone who used to work in retail, I can attest to the fact that one of the mall locations I worked at was undoubtedly haunted. Of course, it's not uncommon for jobs with basements or an eerie backroom situation to have an unsettling atmosphere. But this was something else entirely. The basement under the mall was a particularly creepy spot, and even on my very first day of working there, I heard people talking about the strange experiences that they had encountered while down there. I myself had a few encounters that left me shaken. There was something about the atmosphere down there that just didn't feel right. It was as if the air itself was thick with an unexplainable presence. One day I was down in the basement doing inventory when I heard footsteps coming from the opposite end of the room. I assumed it was another worker, but I called out to them, no one answered. The footsteps continued getting louder and closer, but when I turned around, no one was there. Another time I was walking up the stairs from the basement when I heard someone whisper my name. It was a faint, barely audible sound, but it was enough to send shivers down my spine. I turned around, but again, there was no one there. I wasn't the only one who had experienced these strange occurrences. Other workers had seen shadowy figures moving around the basement and heard unexplainable noises, felt an inexplicable sense of unease. The strange thing was that these occurrences didn't seem to be limited to the basement. There were reports of odd happenings throughout the mall. It's hard to explain what made the Fox Mills Hall so haunted. Perhaps it was the location. Or maybe there was something sinister lurking in the walls. Whatever the cause, it was clear that this was no ordinary mall. Even now, years later, I still get chills thinking about the strange encounters I had while working there. So the fridge did a thing. Let me share with you a rather unusual incident that happened to me this morning while I was preparing breakfast in my kitchen. Everything seemed normal until I heard a strange fiddling sound that seemed to be coming from behind me. I didn't pay much attention to it, and I assumed that it was just my fridge making its usual noises. However, the sound persisted, and suddenly I heard a loud click. I quickly turned around to see what was happening, and to my surprise, the little door of my fridge was wide open. But this little door is something we hardly ever use. It's only big enough to store cans or bottles, and we don't even keep our eggs in the fridge. But if you need to use it, you just have to press a button and it'll open. To close it, you push it until it clicks into place. I was taken back by this sudden occurrence, and as I turned back towards the kitchen door, I saw it slowly lowering down until it was completely open. I pushed it closed and walked out of the kitchen, feeling perplexed by what had just happened. It was as though the fridge and the door were conspiring to get my attention. This event reminded me of another time when something equally bizarre had happened to me. It was almost impossible, like defying gravity. I can't help but wonder if there's some sort of supernatural force at work here, or if it's just a strange coincidence. Either way, it left me with feeling unsettled and perplexed. Please explain this. I think this ghost gave me a hickey. A long time ago, when I was on a cruise with my family for my 15th birthday, something bizarre happened that still baffles me to this day. It was 2019, and we were traveling from Australia to the southern parts of New Zealand and back again. During the first week of the trip, I spent a lot of time in the youth programs with other teens and didn't return to my cabin until almost midnight or 11. My cabin was connected to my parents' room, and my brothers and I shared a room. When I got back, my mom was still awake and quickly lectured me about the late hour. My brother was already fast asleep, and I was fine in the shower, but when I looked in the mirror to brush my teeth, I noticed a dark red hickey on my collarbone. It was about the size of someone biting into an apple. It freaked me out. I remembered shaking and freaking out, but I went to bed anyway. The next day, I told my mom about it, and she was just as startled and confused as I was. We didn't mention it to my dad or brother and left it to rest, continuing to enjoy our trip. It's been 4 or 5 years since that incident, and I've started thinking about it again recently. I've tried to retrace my steps and think of everything that's happened prior to the incident, but I'm left with nothing that makes sense. Even though I try to be a skeptic and find a reason for what happened, I can't explain it. I'm hoping that someone reading this, or hearing this, in this case, might be able to shed some light on this strange and unsettling event that's stuck with me all these years. My daughter was born with mild tracheomalacia, a soft windpipe. The only trouble it ever caused was that she would make a whistling sound sometimes when she was breathing, especially when she was excited or upset. Fast forward to when she was about 4 months old and fast asleep in her crib one evening. Her older brother had the stomach flu that day and had been throwing up. We thought the baby hadn't caught it, but a little while after we put her to bed, we suddenly heard her softly sputtering on the monitor. Then silence for a few seconds, then a huge loud wail, which made both my husband and I run even faster to her room. By the time we got to her, she had fallen eerily quiet again. We saw that she was gasping for air, choking and unable to clear the vomit from her throat and get a clean breath. Even after we picked her up and cleared her mouth, she continued to gasp. She turned blue and then gray. As I drove with her quickly to the ER, she had partially recovered by the time we got there. They gave her O2, a chest x-ray, then a clean bill, and we left. Fast forward about 2 hours later when I'm back in my bedroom with her sleeping upright in the baby seat next to me in bed. My husband and I talked briefly about what would have happened had the baby not cried out so loudly. Would we have reacted so quickly? Would she have recovered? I'm in and I'm about to sleep myself because I kept checking her. One of the times, just before I'd fully awoken, I looked out in the hallway and saw my grandfather, who had passed away a few years prior. When he was alive, he wasn't the most involved granddad, but when he met my husband, my boyfriend at the time, they had an instant connection. When he passed away, his last coherent words were, "I'm not going to make it to altruitis in Mr. Altruitis' wedding, am I?" He loved my husband dearly. Anyway, I see him out in the hall this night, and he's just standing there in khakis and a polo, with his hands in his pockets. In my dream state, I see all my children except the baby, pulling at his arms and playing with him. He has a simple smile on his face. He looks over towards the baby's room, back at me, and says, "I'm sorry I made her cry, but I'm glad she's okay." I have a friend, let's call her Jane. And she knows someone who owns a small business. This business is located in an old house, and there had been reports of strange occurrences happening within the office. The owner, suspecting that the place was haunted, decided to hire a team of ghost hunters to investigate. Skeptical Jane asked to join, and so she was present when the ghost hunters arrived. The ghost hunters went through the business with their instruments, pointing out the hot spots and cold spots in the building. Jane was unimpressed by their methods, but things got interesting when the ghost hunters decided to put a radio on scan and ask questions to the supposed ghost. They received clear responses to their queries, even though the radio was scanning through static and intermittent talking. The first question asked was, "Has anybody died in this house?" And the voice on the radio answered, "6 people." The ghost hunters continued their line of questioning, and the answers became more and more specific. When asked how they had died, the voice on the radio responded with a chilling answer, "Fire." The business owner then asked, "Why are you messing with my staff?" To which the voice replied, "My staff." As the session went on, the ghost hunters noticed that the voice on the radio was getting agitated. They suggested stopping, but the business owner wanted to ask one more question. However, when he did, the voice on the radio shouted, "No more questions," in a loud and clear tone. Jane, who remained skeptical throughout the experience, was genuinely frightened and disturbed by what she had heard. She admits that there must be some sort of explanation for what had happened, but she, along with everyone else, remains completely clueless as to what it could be. The mystery of the haunted office continues to creep them out. Paranormal activity on MT Ranch. The ranch in question is massive, covering about 18 sections. A section is 1 square mile or 640 acres, and it's 2/3 deeded, with the rest being either BLM or state-owned. This land is incredibly rugged, being covered in clay hills and deep canyons, and is for the most part unfenced. There are several buffalo jumps on the ranch, where hundreds of years ago the Indians would chase herds of buffalo off cliffs to their deaths. You can still find buffalo bones at these sites. Supposedly, the ranch was also the site of a massacre, where an entire village of Hidatsa were killed by their enemy, although I haven't found any actual records of that incident. Also on the ranch are 2 abandoned homesteads, the Mint Place and the Carter Place. These are fake names as the families still live in the area, and I want to keep their information private. The Mint Homestead is merely 1 mile off of the county road and relatively easy to access, so my brother and I still use dated cattle pens that are a part of it. The Carter Place is more remote, however, only being accessible by horseback as the trail that went on washed out many years ago. All that's left of the Carter Place is a log cabin with the roof caving in, an old corral system, and a barn that's toppled over. The last people that lived in the Carter house were the Carter family themselves, but during the 1930s the father went crazy and murdered the entire family before turning the gun on himself. At least, that's what people said. The ranch's current owner lives in California, and they've owned the ranch since purchasing it from the Mint family sometimes during the 1980s. My brother and I began leasing the ranch in 2007. There was some unusual activity at first, mainly random lights, but nothing that couldn't be explained in a reasonable way. The strangeness began in 2017, after a well was drilled on the property. I wonder now if this may have unleashed something. During the fall of 2017, I was searching for strays on horseback when I was approached by 2 frantic hunters. These hunters claimed that they were being stalked by a pack of wolves, but I was dismissive, as there had not been a wolf in this area since the 1920s. The hunters claimed that they knew there was a difference between wolves and coyotes, and they were obviously certain that what was stalking them were wolves. Whatever it was had seriously bothered them. Later in the year, when we were trucking cattle away from the ranch and back to the home place, we found out that there were a dozen head short. Despite us running 600 cattle on the property, we kept very close tabs on the herd, and it was unusual to lose more than 2. But no matter how many times we searched and recounted, we couldn't find the missing cattle. This began a trend, And so far since 2017, there's been a total of 138 unaccounted for cattle, a financial loss of 165 grand. Though there are many odd events that I could recount, there's one that stands out. This took place in October 2020. Myself, my brother, and my brother's eldest son were gathering the cattle and herding them into the Mint homestead, where they could be loaded onto trucks and taken to our home ranch for the winter. By this point, the weird activity on the ranch had increased, so much so that we never went on the ranch without being armed. This day was no exception, and strapped to the saddle under my left leg was a Winchester 30-30 rifle. The morning went well, and by noon we had gathered 200 head, which we penned up at the Mint place. After eating a quick lunch, my brother and nephew loaded their horses and left. My nephew had a football game later that day. I stayed alone and rode northwest toward the Carter homestead. The first strange thing to happen was when I rode down the canyon. As I was riding, I could hear multiple howls and cries coming from all directions. I can't describe what these howls sounded like, because they were like nothing I'd ever heard before or since. As I continued riding into the canyon, I was overcome with a feeling of dread. My horse Ace seemed to pick up on this as well and began spooking at almost every shadow. This was very out of character for him, as he was usually a very calm and collected horse. This second strange thing was when I approached the Carter homestead. As I crested a hill in front of it, something jumped out of an old log cabin and ran in the opposite direction. I was still close to a mile away, so I had to use my binoculars to get a better look. What I saw through the lenses chilled me to the bone. It was a wolf, but it was massive and solid black. It was so large that it could be mistaken for a black bear, but it was undeniably canine. After seeing the wolf, my gut told me to turn around and come back later with company, but I ultimately continued. Throughout the course of the afternoon, I managed to convince myself that the wolf I saw was nothing more than a coyote, and that its black fur was just a shadow. It was nearing dusk before I arrived back to the Mint place, herding 30 head of cattle in front of me. After I penned the cattle up, I led Ace back to my pickup and my horse trailer. From a distance, I could see there was something wrong with the trailer, and as I approached, I found that the axle had come apart. It didn't make any sense to me, as it was fine when I drove in, and there was no explanation as to what could have made it come apart when it wasn't even moving. By this time, it was fairly dark outside, and as we were coming out the next day, I decided to unhook the trailer and leave Ace in the corral overnight. When I left, I saw 3 blue lights near the corrals, but I attributed these lights to hunters, so I continued driving. I also heard some more of these howls I had heard earlier in the day. When all 3 of us arrived the next morning, we find the corrals a total mess. All the grass was turned up inside the corrals where the cattle had been milling, and the fence was broken in several places. The cattle that were penned up in the night before were nowhere to be found, along with Ace. My brother and nephew took off on horseback to try to locate some of the cattle and Ace, but only managed to find about 20 head. As I was about without a horse, we repaired the trailer and left later in the afternoon. The next day, all 3 of us rode, and we searched exclusively for Ace. During this time, I covered a lot of country that I would have otherwise missed, and I discovered more bizarre things. At the bottom of one canyon were hundreds of holes, about 1 foot in diameter and 3 feet deep. These holes had been dug by people, as if there would be no animal that would have dug them. I also found a bone pile, which was exceptionally strange. There were carcasses of 4 cows all piled on top of each other in an area that they typically wouldn't have been accessing. At first, I thought that this was maybe the act of poachers who were illegally killing and butchering cattle at the ranch. But there would have been no way to get to this location with a pickup or a 4-wheeler for that matter. The more we searched, the less sense everything even made. We searched for 3 days before we came across something. My brother radioed me, and there was no cell service, and he believed he had found Ace. My nephew and I rode to his location, and sure enough, at the bottom of a sinkhole, and sinkholes are very common in this area, was the carcass of Ace, along with 3 cows. The sinkhole was at the bottom of a canyon, with the walls of this canyon being 300 feet tall, the sinkhole being another 20 feet deep. It took an hour just to climb down the canyon wall when I finally approached the sinkhole. I found Ace to be heavily mutilated. Both ears were removed, along with the eyes and nostrils and hooves. The back of him was not exposed, but it looked like his tail had also been removed. The cows surrounding him had similar mutilations. As was the case with the howls, the wolf, and the trailer, none of this made sense. It would have been almost impossible for just one cow to end up in this location, let alone 3 cows and a horse. There were also no tracks leading into it or out of the sinkhole in the canyon. The sheriff and the veterinarian were both notified and an investigation was launched. The ultimate conclusion was that something had caused the cattle to spook and break out of the corrals, and whatever was spooking them ran all the way to the mint place to the bottom of the sinkhole in which they perished. When I mentioned the wolf I had seen, they were dismissive, just as I had been when the hunters told me of the wolf 3 years prior. No foul play was suspected and the case was closed. Though there were many strange things that have happened since then, there were none quite as upsetting as the loss of my horse. Cattle continued to go missing, and we now only ride the place in pairs. My brother and I are thinking about terminating the lease, as for the moment, the current cattle losses are unsustainable. I've always been a big YouTube watcher, and I found that many stories on the site came from Reddit, so I decided to share mine. Though I don't have any pictures of Ace in the sinkhole, my phone was destroyed in an unrelated incident that I didn't have my files backed up. I do have pictures of a separate bone pile and some of the ranch. Cemetery experience. Traveling back in time to Yugoslavia in the 1980s, more specifically in Macedonia, I have an eerie story to tell you. It all started with my dad's friend, who was a teenager at the time, and was part of a group of friends that used to hang out together. The story takes place in a cemetery, as they used to go there often, being in a rural area surrounded by mountains and forests. One dark night, while they were walking along the cemetery, they noticed some strange figures in the distance. Being the daring teens that they were, they started walking towards them, and as they got closer, they could see that these people looked human, but their clothes were outdated, as if from another time period. Not being intimidated, my dad's friend yelled, "Hey!" to get their attention, but they just kept on walking, not paying them any mind. Feeling provoked, the group of friends continued walking towards the strange group, yelling and trying to get their attention. The strange group continued to walk slowly and deliberately, and even started laughing at their group of friends, as if they were playing with them. This made the group of friends angry, and they wanted to confront them and possibly mug them. "What village are you from?" yelled my dad's friend, but still no response. The group started picking up the pace, then running and eventually sprinting. They just couldn't catch up to the strange figures, even though they were walking slowly. It was then that they realized that these people weren't human. Fear set in and they ran for their lives, eventually escaping to the cemetery. It was only after that they left the cemetery that they realized that the strange figures had disappeared, as if they were never there to begin with. For years, my dad's friend and his group of friends tried to make sense of what had happened that fateful night. They couldn't find any explanation for the strange figures they encountered in the cemetery. It was as if they'd stepped into a different dimension, one where time was irrelevant and things were not what they seemed. This story is a reminder that there's still many mysteries in this world that we've yet to uncover. Perhaps there are things out there that we can't comprehend, and things that we should leave alone and not provoke. This tale is a chilling reminder that there are some things that should remain a mystery. Ghost at my mom's house. When I was growing up, odd things would happen in my childhood home. It wasn't until I was an adult that I realized there was a ghost in my bedroom. This man would stand at the end of my bed and follow me around the house, sometimes scratching and hitting me in the night. It was a terrifying experience, one that I wouldn't wish on anyone. Even now, my partner and children refuse to sleep in that room without me, even though I've told them the stories because it feels weird. My mom, on the other hand, is a diehard skeptic when it comes to ghosts. She doesn't want to believe that there's something in her house, but this morning she came downstairs to find all the photos on one wall had come off. They were on hooks and they were all hanging, and still on the wall and not bent, which means that the photos must have been lifted up off the hooks and flown across the room. Some of them fell straight down while others ended up 6 feet away. This event made my mom finally see that there's something in this house. She freaked out, understandably so. We've never had this kind of activity in the house before, and it's unsettling to think that there might be something lurking in the shadows. Despite her skepticism, my mom's now open to the idea that there might be a ghost in the house. Who knows what other strange things might happen in the days or weeks to come. Experience last night. Let me tell you a story about the strange and unsettling experience that happened to me last night. It's a story that'll chill you to the bone and leave you questioning everything you thought and knew about the world we live in. It all started when I was laying in my bed trying to drift off into sleep. As I closed my eyes and relaxed my body, I suddenly became aware of the presence in the room with me. I knew instantly that it was a ghostly figure that had been haunting my room for some time now. At first, I tried to ignore it and focus on falling asleep, but then something strange happened. As I was getting closer and drifting off, I heard a whisper in my head. It was like someone was speaking directly into my mind. I was confused and frightened, as I knew I was home alone and there was no one else in the room with me. I opened my eyes and looked around, but there was no one there. The room was dark and silent, and the only sound I could hear was the beating of my own heart. Suddenly, I felt a rush of cold air, as if freezing wind had blown through the room. It was so cold that it took my breath away, and I gasped for air. But as I was gasping, I felt something strange happening to my body. It was like the cold was seeping into me, spreading through my veins and chilling me to the bone. Then the sensation became even more intense as I felt something cold pass through me and out the back of my head. It was like I was being invaded by something, and I could feel his presence all around me. I was terrified and I didn't know what to do. For a moment, I lay there frozen, unable to move or even breathe, but then I knew I had to do something. I got up from my bed and stumbled towards the door, my body shaking with fear. As I reached for the handle, I felt a sudden burst of energy and flung the door open. I ran down the hallway and into the living room where I collapsed on the sofa, gasping for air. I was shaking all over and my heart was pounding so hard that I thought it would burst out of my chest. I knew that something terrible had just happened to me, and I didn't know if I'd ever be able to sleep again. To this day, I still don't know what caused that strange and terrifying feeling. Was it really a ghost that haunted my room? Or was it something else entirely? All I know is that I'll never forget that particular night, and I'll always be haunted by the memory of the cold, dark presence that invaded my body and my mind. We used to live in a haunted house. In the depths of my memory, I can recall a time when my family lived in a 3-floor building. Our family was large, and we all had our fair share of experiences within the walls of that house. I'll start with my own experience, which was brief but unnerving. Often I would hear loud footsteps coming from the 3rd floor, as if someone was running or stomping with all their might. But when I investigated, there was never anyone up there. Additionally, I would hear the sound of a large wood block being dragged across the floor, and knocks on the window. And in the bathroom, the lights would mysteriously turn off and then back on again. My brother, who slept in the guest house separate from the main building, once woke up at 2 or 3 a.m. to see a baby crawling toward him. He was so frightened that he jumped out of bed and didn't return until sunrise. Another brother of mine went to watch a movie in the same guest house. After he finished and unplugged the TV, he left the room, but moments later he heard the sound of the TV still playing despite it being unplugged. My sister claims to have seen the wood block being dragged by an unseen force. Although I had only heard it being moved before, she saw it. And my mother, during her prayer sessions, would often feel someone standing behind her, whispering into her ear. In addition to all these experiences, we would occasionally see a black cat roaming around the house, even though we had reportedly kicked her outside. Overall, the house seemed to be filled with a multitude of unexplainable occurrences, each one leaving us feeling uneasy and unsure of what to do next. Though we eventually moved out of the house, the memories of those strange events continue to haunt us to this day. What are the odds? Approximately 2 years prior to purchasing my current house, a tragic event occurred in what is now my room, a murder-suicide. As a result, one might wonder if paranormal activity should be expected. Despite residing here for the past 8 years, little has occurred, save for the occasional sound of pots and pans being thrown into the kitchen floor. While I'm curious about the possibility of paranormal activity, I'm uncertain of the best course of action to explore this curiosity. One might argue that the odds of experiencing paranormal activity are heightened given the history of the house. After all, a tragic event occurred within these walls, leaving behind residual energy that could manifest in supernatural ways. However, I have found that the sounds of pots and pans being thrown onto the kitchen floor are easily explained away by natural causes, such as settling of the house or the occasional rodent. Despite my skepticism, I can't help but be curious about the possibility of paranormal activity in my home. There are various methods that one might employ to explore this possibility, such as conducting a paranormal investigation or hiring a professional to conduct an energy cleansing of the house. However, I'm hesitant to engage in these activities as I'm unsure of the potential consequences and I don't want to invite negative energy into my home. Ultimately, the decision to explore the possibility of paranormal activity in my home rests with me. While the history of the house may suggest that such activity is possible, my personal experiences have been relatively uneventful. Therefore, I must weigh the potential risks and benefits before deciding whether or not to engage in further investigation. Seven. Not a truck driver, and this falls under creepiest and not paranormal. A little after 9/11, about a year later, my ex and I, both black and both active duty, are traveling across America for an adventure to get our next duty station instead of flying out. We were in the Midwest, I think near the Oklahoma or Arkansas border on Interstate 40. We were on a 2-lane, and in the left lane about to pass a truck driver and then go back into the right lane. As we got about midway, the truck driver started driving into our lane. We slowed down. We went back over. We speed up. He crept over again. I was driving, by the way. He clearly did not want me to drive past him. I slowed down again, sped up even faster. He completely cut us off, and I ended up driving 85 miles an hour in the dirt to avoid being hit by the driver. I almost lost control. I got back on the road, and I continued to speed until I couldn't see him in my rearview mirror. That night we went to a hotel to check in. The clerk was acting funny. People were staring at us. We didn't feel comfy at all. Even when the clerks asked what brought us here, we were like, "Oh yeah, just some active duty military here. Going on our next duty station and wanted to drive across America." We went straight to our room and didn't come out until we checked out. The next day we went back out to our car and there was a bullet hole in our bumper. My car at the time was brand new, as in a few days before I had just driven it hot off the lot. And I was proud of my car, so I did the 365 checks a lot, like the rental company does. And my car was pristine the day before when we were in New Mexico. Not only were we almost driven off the road and almost killed, but we were shot at some point. I was driving a shortcut from 29 Palms, California to Albuquerque, New Mexico. 29 Palms is located in a desolate, high desert area east of LA. The shortcut was all two-lane road through total nothingness, except for passing through Amboy. Amboy is a nearly abandoned town near as far below sea level as Death Valley, with dormant volcano and lava field on one side and a salt flat on the other. It was also, at the time, a hotspot for satanic group activity. So I was driving by myself in the afternoon. I stopped in Amboy and snapped a picture of the city sign, just to prove I was there to friends who dared me to take the route on I-40. I got back in my car and proceeded to drive up the mountain range between Amboy and I-40. Once I reached the top, I'm driving north through a canyon with grass high on both sides of the road. Up ahead, I see some stuff in the middle of the road. As I approach, I slow down and see a red Pontiac Fiero stop sideways across both lanes. A suitcase opens and clothes scattered everywhere. 2 bodies lying face down on the road, a man and a woman. I stop 100 feet or so, and their hair on their back of their neck is standing up. Being a Marine, I reach under my seat and pull out a 9mm pistol and chamber a round. Something seemed very wrong. Getting out of the car seemed unthinkable. It was the horror movie move. As I scanned the road, I saw a line I could drive, past the guy in the road on his left, swerve to the right of the woman, behind the Fiero, and I'd be on the other side. I dropped it into first gear, punched it, drove the line as I planned. I passed the back of the Fiero without hitting it in either of the bodies on the road. I continued forward a couple 100 feet and slowed down so I could breathe and let my heart slow down. As I looked up into the rearview mirror, I saw that the 2 bodies had gotten up to their knees, and 20 or so people emerged from the tall grass on either side of the road by the car and bodies. At that time, my foot smashed the gas pedal to the floor and did not let up until I had to slow down for the I-40 East on-ramp. I will never know what would have happened to me if I'd gotten out of the car to check on the bodies or stopped my car closer to them. Somehow, I do not think I would have been good. Sometimes real life can be scarier than a movie. Not a long-haul trucker, but in a van with my brother's band, heading back in the middle of the night from a tour. This must have been around 2008, 2009. I was sat up front, with my bro in the middle. The guitarist in the band was driving. It was a splitter van, so we had 3 seats in the front. Everyone else was asleep in the back. It was about 2 or 3 a.m., and we were on the motorway, headed back to Devon, where we lived. As we were driving along, we noticed a clearing in the trees coming up on the opposite side of the road. It was lit with an eerie green light. As we drove alongside it, all we saw was the silhouette of a body hanging by a rope around its neck from a tree, backlit by this bright green light. We were all super freaked out and discussed whether we should find and slip out and try to go back. We decided we were too scared to do that, so we called the police. We told them exactly where we were, what mile marker we were at, and they said they would investigate it. We called again the next day. They'd gone to look but found nothing. We speculated on what could it have been. But if someone was trying to freak people out with a mannequin, was it an actual suicide? But why the green light? And why did the police find nothing? The weirdest thing about it is that the police found nothing. I would be questioning my own sanity if I'd been the only one to see it, but all 3 of us did. Sober and awake saw it at the same time. It's the only paranormal experience I've ever had. Sounds weird to me 10 years later, though.